Hello, Grand Archive players. Let's answer a rules question. How does Brackish Lutist work? Brackish Lutist has a static ability that is always in effect as long as it is on the field. This is a replacement effect. Remember, replacement effects don't use the stack and they directly modify whatever game event they're looking for. In this case, Brackish Lutist affects all cards with floating memory that would try to enter the graveyard from any zone. This includes, but is not limited to, being destroyed from the field, milled from a deck, discarded from a hand or memory, resolved from the stack, or cleaned up from an intent. Any floating memory that would attempt to be put into a graveyard are put into banishment instead. Note that on-kill and on-death effects specifically look for a unit moving from the field to the graveyard. So, for example, if player A controls a level 2 champion using Clean Cut to kill player B's ally with floating memory, this on-kill will not trigger. And if player B also controls something that triggered from the ally's death, such as a Life Essence Amulet, that wouldn't trigger either. This Honorable Vanguard did not die since it did not go to the graveyard. Brackish Lutist caused it to go to banishment instead. On the other hand, discarding a card does not require it to go to the graveyard. If a player with Mage class bonus discards a Fire Element floating memory with Creative Shock, they will still be able to deal 2 damage. Likewise, discarding Spectre type floating memory to Rile the Abyss will still allow its controller to draw extra cards, even though that floating memory goes to banishment instead of the graveyard. Discard looks at cards as they leave the hand, not as they enter the graveyard. Also note that a card needs to have floating memory active at the time it enters the graveyard. If the floating memory is restricted by a class or level requirement, that card is not considered to have floating memory until that requirement is met. For example, if a player was less than level 2 and a card like Dredging Streams went to the graveyard, Brackish Lutist would not affect it. Even if they leveled up later in the game, Brackish Lutist will still not affect it in the graveyard. Brackish Lutist does not care about cards in the graveyard, she only affects cards that would enter a graveyard. For this reason, she also has no interaction with Censor of Restful Peace. Even though Censor would cause a card with floating memory to lose that ability in the graveyard, Brackish Lutist isn't concerned with what a floating memory card looks like if it hypothetically were in the graveyard. She cares about what it looks like as it's trying to enter a graveyard. Now let's look at some more specific interactions involving Brackish Lutist leaving the field. What happens if a player activates Primordial Ritual, sacrificing Brackish Lutist? Where does the ritual go? How about any floating memory milled from their deck? As part of the process of activating a card, it moves onto the stack, then we resolve its effects, then it moves to its owner's graveyard. For Primordial Ritual, we move it onto the stack and must pay costs, including reserve cost and sacrificing the ally. While Primordial Ritual is on the stack waiting to resolve, Brackish Lutist is already gone from the field, and so her static ability is not in effect. Thus, any floating memory milled, as well as Primordial Ritual itself, will go safely to the graveyard. How about if a player, either player, doesn't matter which, activates Repelling Palm Blast? Where would the Palm Blast go? So, while resolving Repelling Palm Blast on the stack, we follow its instructions and return all allies with 2 or less power to their owner's hands, which includes Brackish Lutist. Repelling Palm Blast is finished resolving and we try to move it to its owner's graveyard. Brackish Lutist is no longer in the field to do anything about this, so the Palm Blast goes to the graveyard. Let's look at this example. A player activates an action card, such as Refracting Missile, which would deal enough damage to kill Brackish Lutist. Where does the Refracting Missile go? When Refracting Missile resolves, it will deal its damage to Brackish Lutist. Then, having finished resolving, it will move to its owner's graveyard. Note something very important here. At this moment, Brackish Lutist is still in play. Lethally damaged units are moved to their owner's graveyard as a state-based check, which are performed before or after the full resolution of an activation or trigger, but not during. Refracting Missile needs to resolve in its entirety, including moving it off the stack and into the graveyard before state-based checks are performed. So, when the game is deciding where the Refracting Missile should go, Brackish Lutist effect is still applying, and will put that card into banishment. Immediately afterward, state-based checks will put the lethally damaged Brackish Lutist into the graveyard from the field. Let's keep going. What if a player attacks Brackish Lutist for lethal damage with an attack with floating memory, such as a Savage Attack? In the combat phase, during the damage step, Brackish Lutist will receive combat damage. The game will immediately move to the end of combat step. One of the first things that happens in this step is that cards and intent are moved to the graveyard or banishment if applicable. Immediately afterwards, state-based checks are performed. Similar to the previous example, the game attempts to put Savage Attack into the graveyard while Brackish Lutist is still on the field, so Savage Attack will be banished. Brackish Lutist will die and leave the field during the next state-based check. This same interaction applies to other cards that go into intents, such as arrows like Savage Arrow, and Aether Charges like Charge the Soul, if they are used for an attack. Aether Charges can be used as action cards or as intents during an attack, and function differently in each case. Charge the Soul will not be banished if it is activated as an action card and loaded as it resolves, since it will move from the stack to the loaded zone of an Aether Wing, rather than go to the graveyard upon resolution. One more example. If an ally with floating memory, such as Fire-tuned Automaton and Brackish Lutist, engage in combat and kill each other, where does that ally go? In this case, it doesn't matter who attacks the other. The attacker and retaliator, whoever they are, will deal combat damage simultaneously in the combat damage step. Then, in the end of combat step, state-based checks are performed. This check sees that both of these allies are lethally damaged and should be put into their respective owners' graveyards. Actions in a single state-based check are done simultaneously, so these cards are moved simultaneously. It might not be immediately clear where the Fire-tuned Automaton should go in this case, since Brackish Lutist is also leaving the field. But since these movements are simultaneous, when the game is determining where to put it, the game state it looks at is this, where both allies, including Brackish Lutist, are still on the field. Therefore, the game puts Fire-tuned Automaton into banishment. Lastly, I'll mention something about Brackish Lutist that doesn't have to do with its abilities, its type line. Brackish Lutist has the Melody subtype, so activating it will qualify to enable Harmonize. Also, you may banish your Brackish Lutist with Clockwork Music Box as you play her. I'm not sure why you would want to do this except under the most exceptional circumstances, but you can do this. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching.